Please welcome President and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, Michael Farris.
I have this hope in the depth of my soul.
Good morning. How many of you are here this morning? Good, several of you. That's great. This morning, I want to talk to you about a topic, will we be silenced? There's a growing movement in this country that can perhaps be described as tolerant totalitarianism. Now, the adherents of this movement preach tolerance and diversity, but we need to understand some important things before we really dig in to their hypocritical and inconsistent philosophy. First of all, I want to encourage you to understand there's an important difference between tolerance and liberty. And once you understand that difference, I hope you will never, ever settle for being tolerant. Tolerant is beneath the standard that Christians and, frankly, all Americans should aspire to. You know, there's two relevant definitions of tolerance. One is in the personal relationship sphere, and the other is in the legal sphere. In the personal relationship idea, tolerance means, I really don't like you, but I'm going to put up with you. Christians are called to love people that are different from them. In fact, we're called to love those that despitefully use us and hate us. Love is a much, much higher standard than mere tolerance. And on the legal side, understanding tolerance, perhaps the best glimpse into that is with the Toleration Acts of William and Mary of 1688. If you didn't attend the Church of England in 1688, your church would be tolerated under the following conditions. There were 39 articles of faith for the Anglican Church. You could differ in 5 of those. Not 5 of your choice, 5 of their choice. And you couldn't differ in any old way you wanted to. You could differ in the ways they prescribed. It was like a toggle switch. You could believe A or B on these 5 issues. And if you believed A or B on those 5 issues, then you were tolerated. Now, you couldn't call yourself a church because there was only one true church, and that was the Anglican Church. So that's why we have Quaker meeting houses and Baptist chapels and so on, because they weren't allowed to be called churches. That's tolerance. Tolerance is the idea there is an official orthodoxy, and as long as you don't differ too much, we'll let you alone. But liberty is a much different idea. Liberty means the government has no jurisdiction over the soul of man. Liberty means, thank you, liberty means that the government cannot prescribe an orthodox view on really much of anything. Now, a second preliminary thought here is the idea of diversity. Diversity by the elitists on the left is a superficial form of diversity. It's a diversity of the external examination. You get people in the room and you look at what race they are, you look at other forms of external activity, and this is their definition of diversity. While promoting diversity, they want everybody to think exactly the same. If you don't agree with them on your thoughts, then you've failed in some fashion. So we see surface diversity while preaching actual ideological homogeneity. That's nonsense. True diversity is diversity of ideas, where you get people together who don't agree with each other. And yet in a civil society, despite the fact that we don't agree, we believed in freedom. In fact, the classic American maxim has been, I disagree with everything you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That is a diverse commitment to true diversity. So there's 3 points I want to make today. First, we're going to explore the efforts in this nation to silence voices that differ from the forces of the elitists who believe in coercion. This is going to require us to do a few historical comparisons as well as descriptions of current conflicts. Second, we'll do a few points of analysis and observations that arise from those set of facts. And third, we're going to address the question of what can we do to preserve our liberty. Liberty not only for Christians, but for people of all faiths and all worldviews, including liberty for those who oppose us. So let's begin with a little history. When King James of Scotland assumed the additional title of King of England, he was confronted early on with a petition from Puritan pastors who first asked that the Church of England conform itself to their views on several doctrinal points. When that failed, with King James personally rebutting their suggestions and requests, they then switched their tactics to ask for a religious accommodation, that they and the churches that they led be allowed to differ from the high church Anglicans in certain particulars. James, who was angry and impatient with what he viewed as Puritan insolence, proclaimed, and I quote, "I will have none of that. I will have one doctrine and one discipline, one religion in substance and in ceremony. Therefore I charge you, never speak more to that point." Soon afterwards he added, "If this be all they have to say, I shall make them conform themselves, or else I will harry them," meaning harass them, "I will harry them out of the land, or else do worse." His threats weren't empty. Pastors were fired from their positions. Many were jailed. James preferred, rather than the style of his predecessors of burning people at the stake, which he did a couple of times, he did slow executions by arresting dissenters and letting them die in prison by mistreatment and neglect. Conform yourselves or be harassed out of the land. That is the tool of a tyrant. 333 years later, Jehovah's Witnesses were hauled before the courts of the United States. They too sought a religious accommodation. Let their children be excused from mandatory salutes to the American flag. Their refusals to salute had been met with expulsions from the public schools. The Supreme Court of the United States took up the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Would our heritage of religious freedom prevail in the face of a demand that unwilling children be forced to make a pledge to freedom and justice? A bit ironic when you think about it. And the reason, of course, that they refused to make the pledge was their faith taught them that they should make no pledge except those to God. By a vote of 8-1 in the case of Minersville School District versus Gobitis, the Supreme Court ruled against the freedom of conscience and against the Jehovah's Witnesses. Writing for the majority, Justice Frankfurter proclaimed, and I quote, "The mere possession of religious convictions which contradict the relevant concerns of a political society does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibilities." An aftermath of violence erupted against Jehovah's Witnesses. A mob of 2,500 burned the Kingdom Hall in Kennebunkport, Maine. The Litchfield, Illinois police jailed 60 members of this group on the grounds that it was for their own protection. Jehovah's Witnesses were driven out of towns. One man was castrated. One southern sheriff, who was driving the people out of his own county, explained he was doing so because the Supreme Court had declared them to be traitors. Conform yourselves or be harassed out of the land. The echoes of King James were heard in America, in this land professing liberty. Embarrassed, perhaps, by the consequences of their own action, the Supreme Court reconsidered in a case 2 years later. And in 1943, by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court ruled that the Free Exercise Clause prohibited the West Virginia State Board of Education from forcing Jehovah's Witness children to salute the flag as a condition of attending public schools. 3 of the justices who had voted against freedom in the Gobitis case switched their views. The court issued one of the most profound proclamations of religious liberty ever given in the Barnett case. They said, and I quote again, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any if there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us." Well, in the closing days of the second decade of the 21st century, Christians are being threatened by various agencies of government in ways that can be only characterized as King James-like, as Gobitis-like in their nature and their intensity. We start right here in Colorado. Jack Phillips, who is a man that my organization, Alliance Defending Freedom, is representing in the Supreme Court of the United States. Jack Phillips is a cake designer here in the Denver area. In his cake shop, Masterpiece Cake Shop, he readily serves all people of all sorts, without any hint of discrimination. But serving all people doesn't mean he's willing to create and design cake artistry for all messages. He's refused to create cakes that he thought were lewd or anti-American, for example. And so when a same-sex couple asked him to create a specially designed artistic wedding cake to celebrate their wedding, it was a creative work that his faith would not let him pursue. He said, you can buy anything that's in the shop already pre-made, but I cannot use my artistic talent to design you a cake for this purpose. The Civil Rights Commission here in Colorado, siding with King James and Cobitus, ruled that he must conform himself or get out of the cake business here in Colorado. The commission intends clearly to harass him out of the land. Others have threatened violence against Jack, and they threaten to do more to this God-fearing man. And of course, he's not alone. Now, as I hope you know, the Supreme Court has just granted review in the Masterpiece Cake Shop on the same day that on the same day they ruled in our favor in the Trinity Lutheran case, another case that we argued in the Supreme Court. They granted review. Please pray for us, and especially for Kristen Wagner and for Jack Phillips. Kristen is our lead counsel who's going to argue this case in the Supreme Court, and it's extraordinarily important. I've begun saying this case is for almost all the marbles. There's a few little things that would be not decided by this case, but this case is so massive in its importance. Will probably be the most important free speech, free exercise of religion case in our lifetimes. Another case that handled also by Alliance Defending Freedom demonstrates another aspect of the incursions into liberty from the elite orthodoxy. The Stormans family in Olympia, Washington, has operated a grocery store that has a pharmacy there for many years. In fact, the man my age in the family business, Ken Stormans, and I were elders together at Westwood Baptist Church when I lived in Olympia in the early 1980s. When the state of Washington learned that the family drugstore refused to sell the morning after pill because the Stormans believed that abortifacient would make them complicit in the taking of a human life, the state of Washington and the Ninth Circuit ruled that the state could overrule their religious objection and can force them to conform. The words of Gobitis resound in our ears. The mere possession of religious convictions which contradict the relevant concerns of a political society does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibilities. I thought that view was reversed, but it's reviving again and again. But the sector of our society that perhaps is the most egregious in the concerns that we see for coercion and intimidation are our colleges and universities. At Kellogg Community College in Michigan, students were actually arrested for handing out copies of a controversial document. The document, the Constitution of the United States. They were standing outside the so-called free speech zone. This is yet another case that ADF is handling. Now, I have news for the Kellogg Community College and for all the college administrators in the country who get confused about this. CCCU doesn't get confused, but a lot of colleges are. There is a free speech zone in this country. It's called the United States of America. Yeah. There was another student, we feel very good about our chances of winning the Kellogg case, by the way. And another student in Georgia was arrested. He stayed inside the free speech zone. He gave them their silly due. But because he was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, and because someone was offended, claiming that Jesus is the only way to God, guess what? If you don't believe that Jesus is the only way to God, you're not actually a Christian. You're a syncretist that may have some Christian themes woven into your self-made religion, but all Christians, by definition, believe what Jesus said when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father but by me. That is, by its definition, what Christianity is all about. And so a nation that gets this wrong We're defending that student, by the way, as well. A nation that trains future leaders in theories of repression will no longer be a free nation. This is an issue we must get right. Liberal arts means to train future citizens and leaders in skills and knowledge necessary to live in liberty. That's what it originally meant. When they had liberal arts, it was liberty arts. You could exchange those terms, and they were synonymous in their original meaning. There's nothing liberal in that classical sense that's occurring at most colleges and universities in this country. And we see it in other areas. Lawyers are going to lose their license if they don't conform. Medical professionals are being forced to conform. Business owners are being forced to conform. Media coercion. If you have Christian views and you're a media figure, you're going to be thrown off your television show. And churches are even being threatened. So what are some lessons and observations? First, freedoms are intertwined. A government that will attempt and maybe succeed to coerce you in what you believe, that will invade your soul, will not hesitate to take your property, your children, your guns, and of every other aspect of your fundamental freedoms. Freedoms go together. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, all the amendments go together. And if they start blowing up the First Amendment, the others are not safe either. Second, coercing those who are kicking and screaming on these issues will not lead to civility, and I need to explain the use of that phrase. I did a case in the 1980s where Christian kids in East Tennessee were expelled from the public schools because they didn't want to read textbooks that they believed violate their religious faith. In the course of the litigation, the school district's lawyers stipulated that the books, in fact, violated their religious faith. So that wasn't an issue. The only issue was the legal issue. Could you force kids to read textbooks that violated their faith? The families asked, can't we just read last year's textbooks that had been adopted in the schools for a while? And the schools would not let them. And so I asked the superintendent of schools in deposition why he wanted these kids to be forced to read these textbooks when they were kicking and screaming against it. And he said, after a while, they'll stop kicking and screaming. They want to force us to adopt their views. Now, it won't happen that way. There are some that will cave in, but there are some of us who won't. They literally will have to resort to burning us at the stake before we will ever be silent. So, our third observation is our own silence is undermining our own rights. And I'll try to tell this story briefly. I tried another case in San Diego in 1984, and the issue was a criminal trial evolving out of a custody dispute for a lady that was actually arrested and put in jail. I met her in jail here in Denver, but she was extradited to California where she was tried for kidnapping her own son. And there was a custody dispute between a Christian mom and a homosexual dad. I asked every juror in that case, do you know a born-again Christian and do you know a homosexual? Every juror knew a homosexual, but only one juror out of the whole panel in 1984 in San Diego knew a born-again Christian. The net result was this. They knew born-again Christians, but born-again Christians were not as outspoken as homosexuals. And when people personify issues, when we're talking about homosexual rights, they think of their friends. When we talk about Christians being persecuted, it's somebody they don't even know anybody like that. They think we're foreign entities, and they will not understand us. We need to speak up for ourselves. So what do we do about all this? First, we fight back. In every venue, in every occasion, we fight back. Second, we got to end our voluntary silence. We got to be speaking up for ourselves. Third, we've got to educate our friends and especially our children. And finally, we've got to pray. I have been in many, many courtrooms where I saw, in other venues, where I saw God turn the situation around because of prayer. In one case where a judge told me that before the trial started that we were going to lose today, I asked a question about 2 minutes into the cross-examination where the superintendent of schools revealed that he and the judge had been talking about this case before it ever came to trial. And suddenly, we won that case. And so, I wish I had time to tell you the whole story, but let me just say this in conclusion. I have seen God answer prayer. I've seen him silence talk show hosts. I've seen him reverse judges. I've seen him reverse Congress of the United States. I've seen God through prayer reverse state legislatures. I don't believe that God answers prayer merely because of the stories I've read in the Bible, although I do believe all of those. I have seen it with my own eyes. The situations we face today are not too big for a God who answers our prayers as we are faithful to stand up and fight for what's right. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you.